In this video, I'm going to talk about the difference between mixing and mastering, what it is, and how you should approach it. Mixing and mastering are two of the base components of any production, so it's important that you get it right.
This is a FireWalk production.
Let's start with mixing. Mixing is the process of getting every single element in your track to work well together as a whole. This process is always the same. It doesn't matter what DAW you use. Let's say you have made a track containing all the usual elements such as drums, bass, vocals, guitars, and so on. The first thing any beginner will do is wonder why their track sounds so bad. It usually ends up sounding muddy and jumbled. The composition itself may be good, but it still sounds bad. This is almost always a result of bad mixing. That said, it's important to choose the right sounds to begin with. If you've composed something that just isn't going to work, no amount of mixing or mastering can save you. In order to understand the mixing process, try to envision an orchestra on stage playing a symphony. You'll notice that the placement of the individual players is not random. To achieve a good balance in terms of volume, loud instruments like brass and percussion traditionally go in the back, with the woodwinds and strings in front of them. To avoid clashing, sections with similar ranges or timbres are positioned opposite each other in the binaural field. For example, violins on left, trumpets on the right, horns left, cellos right, and so on. This is important to keep in mind because when you mix your track, your goal is the same. You want every single element in your track to have its own place in the mix. In EDM, we have some awesome tools at our disposal such as EQs, panning, stereo separation, reverb, compressors, and so on. I'll talk more about this later in the video. Try to picture the mix as your stage. You want some things such as your leads or your vocals up front where everyone can hear them clearly. You typically don't see Justin Bieber standing in the rear of the stage, do you? Okay, bad example, but you get the point. You want your main parts to get the most attention. Other things can sit in the back, and some things you want out on the sides. Doing so will make the mix sound a lot cleaner. The first problem an aspiring producer is likely to face is the low end will tend to interfere and overpower everything else in the mix. The high and mid-range drowns out, and it all just becomes more and more muddy as more elements are added. This is something you have to deal with in the mixing process. Again, make sure that everything has its own place in the mix. Take extra care that your low end is sitting well in the mix. Use an EQ to low-cut everything that's not a bass sound, so that the low-end spectrum is reserved for the drums and the bass. Even hi-hats tend to have some low rumble frequencies, and we don't want that. Remember that even if it's just a tiny amount, frequencies tend to build up. Another widely used technique to control the low end is sidechaining. If you don't know what sidechaining is, or you want to learn how to use it, then check out my tutorials about sidechaining. You can find the link to those videos in the description below. There's many tricks to be learned when it comes to things like reverb, compression, and stereo separation. Some famous producers have leads that are really upfront and in your face, while at the same time having a super tight mix overall. That's because they've mastered the art of mixing. I'm going to be making a dedicated How to Mix tutorial very soon, where I'll teach you how to accomplish these things. So be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't done so already. Now that you have a basic understanding of what mixing is and why it's so important, let's move on to the mastering. What is mastering? Well, let's assume that you're done mixing. You should always aim to get your mix sounding as good as possible during the mixing stage. After that, the track should be 99% finished. Mastering is the process of doing that last 1% fine-tuning and polishing before the track is released. Imagine that you've just bought a brand new car, and you put on a coat of wax to make it really shine. The car represents your track after mixing. The wax job should represent the mastering. Another example would be a pretty girl putting on her makeup. As you enter the mastering stage, your track should already be finished. It's about very small fine-tuning. Typically, a mastering engineer will do some very fine EQing to remove any problem frequencies and some light multiband compression. Sometimes a warm tape emulator effect and such are used to make the track sound more warm and analog, as well as some final limiting to make it louder. It's not the same process every time. It depends on the track itself. What one track needs in terms of mastering is perhaps what another track has too much of, and so on. Again, the process is different every time, just as people are different. Every producer has a unique style that requires a unique form of mastering. If you need your track mastered, we can master it for you, but we do charge money for it. Just send me an email and we'll work something out. You can find the contact information in the description below. Mastering is an art itself. It's a highly specialized field, which is why there are dedicated mastering engineers who specialize in it. They have years of experience mastering, and most importantly, they have just the right equipment and facilities to do so. You always have a hard time monitoring in a typical bedroom studio. A mastering studio will have all the necessary sound-absorbing material on the walls and such. It's been designed with just one thing in mind: to reproduce sound as realistically as possible. You'll never be able to obtain the same level of precision in terms of monitoring in your bedroom. That doesn't mean you can't learn to compensate for the way your room sounds, though. Many artists prefer to send their tracks to a mastering engineer despite having the skills necessary to do it themselves. The reason for this, as you work with a track, you tend to become immune to how it sounds. After hearing the same track over and over thousands of times, it can be beneficial to have someone else master it, someone who gets to hear it for the very first time. That way, they can go about mastering it with fresh ears, without having their judgment clouded by having listened to it over and over for so long. This doesn't mean you can't do it yourself. A lot of artists actually prefer to master themselves. It's a personal decision. It's also possible to become good at mastering even though you don't have an ideal monitoring environment. It will take a lot of practice, and it's all about knowing your speakers and your room and how it translates to other rooms and other systems. I'll talk more about this in my upcoming mixing tutorial. That's it! I hope this was helpful. You can help me make more videos like this by supporting me on Patreon. Any contribution will be much appreciated. You can find the link in the description below. I'm uploading new tutorials and templates every week, so make sure to subscribe to this channel so that you won't miss out. Is there any specific tutorial you'd like me to make? Or perhaps you have a question? Just leave me a comment below.